Hey there, night owls and curious minds. What if I told you the man who made the modern world nearly destroyed it himself? This isn't just a story about cars. It's about obsession, power, and a jungle utopia that turned into a muddy disaster. Henry Ford didn't just build an empire, he almost lost it all. Before we start, go ahead, tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment with your country or city. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now get comfy, dim the lights, and let history tuck you in. And hey, if you stay till the end, I've got a little surprise fact that might just change how you see your own job. Before he was a tycoon, before the factories and fame, Henry Ford was just a restless kid who hated cows. He grew up on a farm near Dearborn, Michigan, a wide stretch of land with more grass than ambition. His father wanted him to be a farmer, naturally, but Henry, even as a boy, had no interest in soil, sun, or sowing. He was obsessed with motion, not animals, not people, just motion. At 15, he took apart his pocket watch and put it back together flawlessly. Neighbours started bringing him their broken clocks. By 17, he was the local fix-it guy. But Ford didn't want to fix things. He wanted to build something new, something that moved on its own, no horse, no steam, just fire, steel, and the future. In his 20s, he became an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company. Yes, that Edison, the light bulb guy. Ford admired Edison, but he wasn't dazzled. He worked the night shift so he could use his days to tinker not with light, but with locomotion, specifically the quadricycle. The quadricycle was, well, imagine a lawn chair on 4 bicycle wheels with a gas engine dangerously strapped to the back. That was Ford's first car. It was loud, smelly, and vibrated like a drunk wasp. But it moved, on its own, and that made Henry smile like a man who'd just seen the future. Still, not everyone smiled with him. Ford's first company, the Detroit Automobile Company, flopped hard. Investors bailed. His designs were too fancy, too expensive. He was too obsessed with making things perfect, too slow to ship, too stubborn to compromise. Most people would have quit. Ford didn't. In 1903, he tried again, this time with the Ford Motor Company. And this time he didn't just want to build cars. He wanted to build the car, the one anyone could afford, the one everyone would drive. That car was the Model T. Launched in 1908, the Model T was everything his first cars weren't. Cheap, durable, and ready to rumble down the dirtiest American roads. It had a top speed of about 45 miles per hour, which was fast enough to terrify horses and thrill anyone who'd only known wagons. And America went nuts. By 1910, Ford was selling tens of thousands of Model Ts. By the end of the decade, it was over 1 million. Car ownership had gone from rich man's luxury to regular Joe's reality. The horse was out, the engine was in, towns expanded, highways followed, and for the first time in history, people didn't have to live where they worked, they could drive. But here's the twist. Ford wasn't just selling a product. He was selling a promise that modern life could be faster, cleaner, freer. And yet, even in those glory years, the seeds of trouble were already in the soil. Ford was brilliant, yes. Visionary, no doubt. But he didn't trust anyone. Not engineers, not businessmen, not even his own executives. He wanted control over every nut, bolt, and worker. That meant the next stage of his empire wouldn't be just about speed, it would be about systems, machines that made machines, and people who behaved like them. But that's for the next episode. Because right now, in 1910, Henry Ford was on top of the world. The kid who hated cows had built an empire on rubber and gasoline, and he was just getting started. Henry Ford had already conquered America's dirt roads, but now he wanted to conquer time. Let's rewind to 1913. The Model T was flying out of factories. Ford couldn't build them fast enough. Literally. He tried everything: more workers, longer hours, bigger buildings. Still not enough. And then came the light bulb moment. Why not move the car to the worker instead of the worker to the car? That single question gave birth to the moving assembly line. Inspired by meat-packing plants and grain mills, Ford's engineers rigged up a conveyor belt that dragged a partially built car through the factory, while workers stood still and attached one specific part over and over and over again. At first, everyone thought it was nuts. It looked mechanical, inhuman, cold, and they were absolutely right, but it worked. The time to build one Model T dropped from over 12 hours to just 93 minutes. Let that sink in. 93 minutes to build an entire car, while most people still needed longer to make dinner. Ford's output exploded, prices dropped, sales skyrocketed. By 1914, the company was making more cars than all its competitors combined. But here's where things get weird. Instead of pocketing the profits and calling it a day, Ford did something no one expected. He doubled workers' wages overnight, from $2 and change per day to a jaw-dropping $5. $5 a day wasn't just generous, it was revolutionary. At the time, most industrial jobs were grueling, poorly paid, and wildly unstable. Workers quit constantly. Factories churned through people like broken tools. But Ford wanted stability, loyalty, focus, and $5 got it. Thousands of men lined up outside Ford's gates. Newspapers called it socialism. Wall Street called it insanity. But Ford just smiled and kept counting the orders. Of course, there was a catch. To qualify for the $5 wage, workers had to meet Ford's moral standards. Enter the sociological department, a team of corporate snoops who visited workers' homes, inspected their family life, checked if they drank or gambled, and made sure they weren't, heaven forbid, wasting their money. Yes, the man who put the world on wheels also made sure his workers ate dinner at the right time. It worked, sort of. Productivity soared, turnover plummeted, and the Model T became the car of the people. America was moving not just faster but farther. Entire industries were born in the exhaust. Roadside diners, motels, gas stations, even suburbs. If you've ever sat in traffic on your way to work while sipping bad coffee from a drive-through, you can thank Henry Ford. Sort of. But there was something else happening behind the factory doors. Repetition. Every worker now did one tiny task, over and over. Bolt a wheel, tighten a nut, attach a spring, again, again, again. Ford had made manufacturing efficient but also mind-numbing. People weren't craftsmen anymore, they were parts of the machine. Some workers lost it, literally. Fingers, patience, minds. Turnover still haunted the company. The $5 day helped, but it couldn't fix the deeper problem. Humans weren't built for life on an assembly line. And Ford didn't care. To him, speed was sacred, efficiency was king. If a man couldn't handle it, there were 10 more outside the gate. That obsession with speed would become a pattern, not just in his factories, but in his decisions. Push harder, faster, bigger, always. But in chasing that rhythm, he missed something else, something growing right under his nose. His competitors had started to innovate again, offer different colours, better engines, more features. Meanwhile, the Model T, still black, still basic, still stuck in time. Ford's refusal to change would come back to haunt him. But not yet. For now, in the late 19-teens, he was the king of American industry. His empire ran on gasoline, rubber, and clockwork. And every country on earth was watching. Next time, though, that kingdom starts to crack. By the early 1920s, Henry Ford wasn't just rich, he was legendary. The Model T ruled the roads, the assembly line ruled the factories. And Henry? He ruled everything else. But power has a funny way of making people deaf. And Ford, once the tinkerer who listened to engines like a doctor with a stethoscope, had stopped listening to just about anyone, especially his son. Let's talk about Edsel Ford. Edsel was smart, thoughtful, and painfully polite, the opposite of his bulldozer father. He loved design, innovation, and art. He saw a future where Ford cars were beautiful, modern, and diverse. Henry, meanwhile, thought all that was frivolous. As far as he was concerned, the Model T was good enough, forever. But the world was changing. Competitors like Chevrolet were gaining ground. People wanted style, colour and comfort, not just utility. And yet, Henry refused to budge. In fact, by 1927, the Model T had been on the market for 19 years, ancient by industry standards. It was black, boxy and outdated, like trying to sell a flip phone in the age of smartphones. Finally, with sales slipping and pressure mounting, Ford killed the Model T. But not without a funeral. He literally held a memorial service for the car. Black drapes, emotional speeches, a symbolic goodbye. It wasn't a product change, it was a death in the family. Edsel, now officially company president, pushed for a new era, the Model A, sleek, stylish, and available in multiple colours. It was a hit for a while, but Edsel's leadership existed only on paper. Henry still pulled the strings. Every string. He'd barge into meetings, overrule decisions, even humiliate his son in front of employees. Worse still, he surrounded himself with yes men, especially one in particular, Harry Bennett. Bennett wasn't a car guy, he wasn't even an engineer. He was a former boxer and sailor who became head of Ford's service department, which was less about customer support and more about controlling the workforce. And by controlling, I mean spying, threatening, and sometimes beating people up. You think I'm joking? Let's talk about the Battle of the Overpass. It was 1937. Union organisers from the United Auto Workers showed up at Ford's River Rouge plant to pass out leaflets. What happened next was brutal. Ford's hired muscle, led by Bennett, attacked them in broad daylight. They beat union leaders senseless. One man was thrown down a flight of stairs. Reporters were punched. Cameras smashed. But one photo survived, showing organisers bloodied, battered and defiant. It made national headlines. Ford's empire, once a symbol of progress, now looked medieval, ruthless, paranoid. Henry didn't flinch. He hated unions, saw them as communists, meddlers, enemies. He believed in loyalty, his version of it. And if workers didn't like it, they could leave. This wasn't just bad press, it was bad business. While other companies adapted, Ford dug in, sales slipped, morale sank. And behind the scenes, Edsel, exhausted from the battles with his father, the public, and the company was slowly falling apart. By 1943, Edsel Ford was dead. Cancer. He was only 49. And Henry? He didn't cry, didn't grieve publicly. He simply stepped back in an old man, trying to run a modern company in a world that had moved on. But evenlegens can't outrun time. Most industrialists stick to factories. Henry Ford, however, decided to build a city in the jungle, a neat, orderly, all-American paradise carved into the heart of the Amazon rainforest. It all started with rubber. By the late 1920s, Ford's growing empire was chewing through more and more of it: tyres, belts, seals, gaskets. And he wasn't thrilled about relying on foreign producers, particularly the British and Dutch, who dominated the rubber trade. Negotiation wasn't Ford's style. He preferred to control everything down to the last drop of sap. So he bought a slice of Brazil and called it Fordlandia. The plan was almost comically ambitious: build a functioning American town in the middle of the rainforest. He envisioned white houses with picket fences, tidy rows of transplanted rubber trees, clean living, jazz music on Sundays, and pot roast in the cafeteria. Workers would follow the Ford code of life: no alcohol, no tobacco, mandatory church attendance, and in return they'd be part of something civilized, something better. But nature doesn't care about your systems. Rubber trees, which grow wild and spaced out in their native habitat, don't cooperate when forced into neat, efficient rows. Diseases spread like gossip at a company picnic. Leaf blight ravaged entire plantations. Insects chewed through everything green. The climate was brutal, the supply chains unreliable, and the soil not half as obedient as Ford expected. The people weren't much more compliant. Brazilian workers, understandably, weren't thrilled about being fed oatmeal and canned peaches instead of traditional food. They chafed under the imposed rules, resented the surveillance, and eventually rebelled. Riots broke out. Buildings were burned. American managers had to flee the site on barges. The whole project spiraled into chaos. And yet Ford, in a twist that perfectly encapsulated his detachment, never visited Fordlandia, not once. He spent millions building a city in his image, halfway around the world, and never laid eyes on it. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was a symptom. By this point, Ford had grown obsessed with more than just business. He wanted control not just over production lines or products, but over people's thoughts, behaviours, even beliefs. At home, his infamous sociological department continued to monitor employees' lives, peering into their homes to judge whether their habits aligned with Ford's moral code. The goal wasn't just productivity, it was purity, his version of it. But the most troubling aspect of Ford's worldview came not in his factories or failed jungle towns, but in the pages of the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper he owned and operated. Beginning in the early 1920s, Ford used the paper as a platform to publish anti-Semitic conspiracies, most notoriously serialized articles based on the fabricated protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most destructive hoaxes of the 20th century. These were Niche writings. Ford's newspaper reached hundreds of thousands of readers, and the essays were later published as a book, The International Jew, which was translated into multiple languages and circulated widely. Among the readers was a young Adolf Hitler who referred to Ford as an inspiration and even kept a portrait of him in his office. Henry Ford, perhaps unknowingly, had stepped far beyond the realm of business and into something darker. His obsession with control, order, and purity had crossed a line and left a stain on his legacy that could never be wiped clean. Eventually, public outcry forced Ford to close the paper and issue an awkward, carefully worded apology. But like most things in his life, he never seemed to truly admit he was wrong. He simply moved on, convinced that the world and history would remember the good and forget the rest. Back in Brazil, Fordlandia slowly rotted into the jungle. The trees collapsed under the weight of their design flaws. The American-style homes filled with spiders and silence. The dream, Ford's dream, decayed not from outside sabotage, but from its own inability to adapt. At home, his company still produced cars. His factories still buzzed. But the man himself was becoming increasingly isolated, surrounded by yes-men and ghosts of better days. The world was changing. The Great Depression was bleeding hope from America. In Europe, storm clouds were gathering, and soon Ford's factories would have to confront something far bigger than efficiency charts and moral codes war. By the early 1940s, the world was on fire. Germany had swallowed Poland, Britain braced itself, America, still clinging to neutrality, began to prepare. War wasn't just coming, it was rolling in like thunder. Every major manufacturer was asked to help. Planes, tanks, engines, munitions. America would need it all, fast. And yet, at first, Henry Ford refused. The same man who built a modern industrial empire didn't want that empire used for war. Publicly, he called it un-American. Privately, he feared the chaos and perhaps the loss of control. He'd always seen his factories as engines of peace, not destruction. But war doesn't wait for comfort. Eventually, under pressure from the government, his board, and even his own conscience, Ford relented. And when he did, the numbers were staggering. At Willow Run, a new facility built practically overnight in rural Michigan, Ford's company began producing B-24 Liberator bombers, not just a few, but one every hour. That wasn't a metaphor. At peak operation, Willow Run turned out nearly 70 bombers a day, an industrial feat no other company on Earth could match. It should have been a triumph, and on paper it was, but behind the factory gates things were coming undone. Henry Ford was no longer the sharp-eyed engineer from Dearborn. He was well into his 70s now, slower, more rigid, often confused. The sudden death of his son Edsel in 1943 from stomach cancer, worsened by years of stress and conflict, devastated the company's balance. Officially, Ford stepped back in as president. In reality, it was a catastrophe. He forgot names, repeated orders, reversed decisions from one day to the next. Executives whispered, workers noticed, The Ford Motor Company, once the model of ruthless efficiency, was spinning in place. Worse still, the government noticed. Ford was a key defense contractor. Billions were at stake. But how could the war effort rely on a man who could barely remember what he said 5 minutes ago? By mid-1945, the writing was on the wall. The solution came not from inside the company, but from a military officer with the kind of bluntness Ford himself might have admired. Charles E. Wilson, head of General Motors' wartime operations, reportedly told Ford bluntly, "Either put your grandson in charge or the government will take over." That grandson was Henry Ford II, only 28 years old, recently discharged from the Navy, and not particularly eager to inherit a collapsing empire. But he did. And to his credit, he began to clean house quickly, brutally, and effectively. He fired the old guard, pushed out Harry Bennett, the sinister security chief who had ruled with fists and fear. He modernized production, rewrote strategy, and, most importantly, made decisions without asking a ghost. As the post-war years began, the Ford Motor Company slowly, painfully, found its footing again. But for the elder Henry Ford, the story was nearly over. He spent his final years mostly out of sight. Sometimes he wandered the factory floor in silence, barely acknowledged. Other times he retreated to his estate, Greenfield Village, a living museum of American nostalgia, horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps, cobbled streets, a world he understood better than the one outside his gates. By the time he died in 1947, Henry Ford was both a legend and a cautionary tale. He had changed the world of that, there was no doubt. He had created a system of mass production that lifted millions. He had put the average American behind the wheel. He had revolutionized labor, even if imperfectly. But he had also resisted change, clung to power too long, spread dangerous ideas. And in trying to build a perfect world, he sometimes forgot the people living in it. That's the paradox of Henry Ford. He gave mobility to the masses, but sometimes refused to move himself. By the time Henry Ford took his final breath in April of 1947, the world he helped create had already started to outrun him. The war was over. Cities were growing. America was shifting into high gear, building highways, selling homes and raising families on dreams made of chrome and convenience. But as his factories kept humming, his influence was beginning to blur at the edges. And that's where the question begins, not where Ford lived or died or how many factories bore his name, but how we remember him. Henry Ford wasn't just an industrialist, he was an idea that got stamped into everyday life. He didn't invent the car, but he reinvented what a car meant, transforming it from a rich man's toy into something a coal miner could afford. He didn't just change how things were made, he changed why they were made and for whom. Mass production, affordable wages, the 40-hour work week. All of that, there's a little bit of Ford in there, whether we like it or not. But legacy isn't just built from victories, it's shaped by blind spots too. Because the same man who empowered the working class also invaded their privacy. The same man who made cars for the people published hate that would influence monsters. He built a world on movement, yet resisted moving forward himself when change demanded it. Ford's greatest strength control was also his greatest flaw. He couldn't stop tinkering, not with machines, not with men, not even with truth. And yet, it's impossible to deny how much of your day, yes, your day, still runs on the rails he laid. The alarm clock, the commute, the routine, the expectation that you'll show up, perform your one task in a massive system, and go home to do it again tomorrow. That rhythm, that life structure, it wasn't born in a democracy or a lab. It was forged on the factory floor with rivets, discipline, and repetition. And now, just like I promised at the beginning, here's a surprising fact that might make you see your job and maybe your boss a little differently. Before Ford introduced the $5 workday, his factories were losing workers so fast they couldn't keep up. The work was so repetitive and soul-crushing that in order to keep just 10,000 jobs filled, Ford had to hire over 40,000 people every single year. That's 4 hires to keep one person in place. People simply walked away. So when Ford offered $5 a day, it wasn't a stroke of generosity, it was damage control. He paid people more not because he loved them, but because he was bleeding talent and needed to plug the wound. That's the part of the story we don't print on commemorative plaques, but it matters. Because it forces us to ask something deeper. When a system seems generous, what is it really compensating for? Henry Ford taught the world how to run like a machine. But the truth is, people aren't pistons or gears. They break in ways you can't always see. And maybe, just maybe, that's why his story still echoes. Not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. He changed the world, but couldn't always change himself. Just like Henry Ford redefined the road with rubber and steel, another man decades before laid the very tracks of American industry with something even harder: steel. And unlike Ford, he wasn't born with much. But he knew how to read people, and books, and the market. His name? Andrew Carnegie. And while you may know him as a rich man, the real story is far messier and far more interesting. Imagine signing away your entire empire with one stroke of a pen and then spending the rest of your life trying to justify how you got it in the first place. That's exactly what Andrew Carnegie did. In the early morning of a quiet February in New York, 1901, Carnegie, now well into his 60s, sat across from J.P. Morgan, the man who would soon create the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Carnegie handed over the steel industry he had built from the dirt up. US Steel was born, and Carnegie walked away the richest man alive. And yet he couldn't sleep at night. Not for the reasons you'd think. The money didn't bother him, neither did the fame. What kept him awake was a single question: had he done more harm than good? Before we dive in, take a second. If stories like this spark your curiosity or help you drift off into deeper thoughts, give this a like, hit subscribe, and settle in. Because if you stay with me till the end, I'll tell you the one decision Carnegie made that haunted him more than anything else, and why he never had the courage to undo it. Now let's rewind. Not to New York, but to Scotland. To a room that smelled of coal smoke and damp earth, where a little boy stared out a cracked window, dreaming of something bigger than survival. Andrew Carnegie was born in the Scottish town of Dunfermline in 1835. To say the Carnegies were poor would be putting it gently. Their home had only one room, with no glass in the windows and no real floor, just packed dirt. His father, William Carnegie, was a weaver, and for a while that was enough. But the world was changing fast. Machines were replacing men, and in towns like Dunfermline, weaving, once a proud and stable trade, was dying. The Carnegies were proud, but pride doesn't pay the baker. As debts piled up, William grew desperate. In 1848, the family sold nearly everything and boarded a ship bound for a place they'd only heard about in letters: America, the land of opportunity. They landed in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, just across the river from Pittsburgh. It was smoky, loud, and rough, but it was alive. Young Andrew, just 13, was thrown into the chaos and told, "Survive." He did more than survive. His first job was as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. No sunlight, no books, just the screech of machines and the sting of lint-filled air. He earned $1.20 a week. But here's where the story takes a turn. Instead of breaking him, that job lit a fire in him. Andrew didn't see the mill as his end, he saw it as his beginning. He watched, listened, memorized. And more importantly, he found escape in books. Now this wasn't easy. Libraries weren't free back then. But a man named Colonel James Anderson opened his personal collection to local working boys every Saturday night. Andrew walked there every week, sometimes with blisters on his feet, just to borrow one book. He devoured Shakespeare, history, math, anything he could get his hands on. He once wrote that a taste for reading was one of the most precious of all the gifts bestowed on mankind. That taste would change everything. At age 15, he got a job as a telegraph messenger. It paid better, but more than that, it gave him access to something even more valuable: information. Andrew mastered telegraphy, even learning to interpret Morse code by ear faster than most adults. He could deliver messages with speed and accuracy that caught attention. And one man in particular noticed. His name was Thomas A. Scott, an executive at the Pennsylvania Railroad, the lifeblood of America's industrial veins. Scott wasn't just powerful, he was a mentor in the making. And Carnegie, he was ready to be mentored. Scott brought him on as his assistant, and suddenly the boy from Dunfermline was sitting in meetings with captains of industry, watching them argue about bridges, routes, and freight rates. This wasn't just upward mobility, this was a rocket ship. But Carnegie didn't just watch, he learned. Quietly, relentlessly, he saw that power wasn't about shouting, it was about timing, knowing when to invest, when to speak, when to step aside. And thanks to Scott's guidance, Andrew made his first real investment, $500, in a company that made sleeping cars for trains. Within a few years it made him $5,000. That first success did something dangerous. It made him hungry, not just for money but for influence, for scale. He didn't just want to ride the trains, he wanted to own the steel they were made from. But how do you go from a few $1,000s to owning the bones of America? Stay with me, because next we meet the man who taught Andrew the real rules of empire and why railroads were only the beginning. Andrew Carnegie was barely 17 when Thomas A. Scott opened the door that would change everything. Scott was a big name at the Pennsylvania Railroad. Not quite a household figure, but to those who moved steel, coal, and people, he was the guy who made the schedules, set the prices, and kept trains moving like blood through America's industrial veins. And Andrew, he was now his personal assistant. The kid who once ran telegraph messages for $1.20 a week was now sitting in leather chairs watching grown men sign deals worth thousands. Scott saw something rare in Carnegie. Someone who wasn't intimidated by money or power, just curious. Obsessed, even. Andrew wrote everything down. He remembered names, connections, whispered prices, who smiled, who lied. He wasn't just absorbing facts, he was decoding the system. And what he learned, he used. One of Scott's greatest lessons: never wait for permission to climb the ladder. Bring your own hammer. Build the next rung yourself. So Andrew did. He noticed the railroad had bottlenecks not just in cargo but in comfort. Long train rides were miserable. Passengers hated the hard benches and noisy cabins. So when he heard about a small company building sleeping cars with cushioned seats, curtains, and actual beds, he smelled opportunity. With Scott's encouragement, he scraped together $500, a fortune to him, and bought a stake in the Woodruff Sleeping Car Company. That investment, it exploded. Within a few years, Andrew had turned it into $5,000. And not just once. Soon he was investing in everything: bridges, ironworks, telegraph lines, coalfields, anything that fed the railway beast or made it run smoother. This was the start of something big. But it came with a dangerous side effect: confidence. Carnegie had money, not enough to retire, but enough to stop listening to anyone who told him to slow down. He started thinking bigger than railroads. What if he didn't just feed the machine? What if he built the machine? That's when he started watching the iron industry. Not from the outside, but like a predator circling a weak herd. At the time, iron was still king. Bridges, rails, buildings all made with it. But iron was brittle, unpredictable, prone to cracking under pressure. The future, as Carnegie soon learned, was steel. Steel wasn't new, but it was expensive to make. That is, until a British inventor named Henry Bessemer introduced a process that could churn it out in massive quantities faster and cheaper. Most American businessmen shrugged. They didn't want to change their factories. Carnegie? He booked a ship to England. He toured Bessemer's works, took notes, made sketches, asked questions, and came back with a glint in his eye. He didn't just want to use the Bessemer process, he wanted to dominate it. Scott was sceptical. Steel was untested. But Carnegie was ready to bet everything, including Scott's money. That's right, he convinced his own mentor to invest with him. If it failed, they'd both be ruined. But Andrew had done the math, and more importantly, he'd read the future. In the late 1860s, he began building the Edgar Thomson Steel Works just outside Pittsburgh. named after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, of course. Politics and business were best friends, after all. Carnegie's steel mill didn't just work, it roared. The secret wasn't just in the Bessemer converter. It was in how Andrew ran the business. Ruthlessly. He drove down costs, cut corners when he could, squeezed suppliers, and pushed his workers to the brink. But he also innovated. He introduced vertical integration, controlling not just the steel mill, but the iron mines, the railways that moved the ore, the coke ovens that powered the furnaces. Everything. He didn't want competitors. He wanted a monopoly. And bit by bit, he got one. By the early 1880s, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than the entire British Empire. Think about that. A Scottish immigrant, a former bobbin boy, had outbuilt the empire that once ruled his homeland. But that power came with a cost. His workers were underpaid and overworked. The hours were brutal, the heat unforgiving, the injury rate staggering. Carnegie kept a friendly image in public, smiling, quoting Shakespeare, donating to libraries. But behind the scenes, he pushed his managers to drive profits up and wages down. And he was about to push them even further, because a storm was brewing, not in the boardroom, but on the factory floor. And soon, it would explode into one of the most violent labour conflicts in American history, a clash that would split Carnegie's legacy in two. But before that storm hits, you have to meet the man Carnegie trusted to run the show. A man even more ruthless than he was. His name? Henry Clay Frick. And when Frick took the reins, blood was inevitable. By the 1880s, Andrew Carnegie wasn't just rich, he was industrial royalty. His name was stamped into bridges, beams, and railroad tracks from Pittsburgh to Chicago. Steel had become the backbone of America's expansion, and Carnegie was its spinal cord. But this wasn't a victory parade, it was a conquest. And Carnegie, he wasn't shy about it. He liked to say, the man who dies rich dies disgraced. And yet he was piling up wealth faster than any man in the country. Every rail laid, every skyscraper planned, every gun barrel forged from Pittsburgh steel added to his growing empire. The key? Efficiency. Obsession-level efficiency. Carnegie's mills didn't just operate, they devoured. Iron ore came from mines he owned. Coal came from rail cars he controlled. Even the ships that crossed the Great Lakes to deliver raw materials were his. This wasn't just vertical integration, it was an industrial ecosystem, and he sat at the top of the food chain. But the true engine of Carnegie's fortune wasn't machinery, it was labour. Men worked 12-hour shifts in blistering heat. They inhaled soot, dodged molten metal, and sometimes never came home. Accidents were common, so were funerals. But Carnegie paid no more than he had to. In fact, the more steel he produced, the harder he squeezed wages. Here's the twist. While all this was happening, Andrew was writing essays about peace, art and charity. He donated money to libraries, schools and cultural centres. He gave lectures about dignity and humanity. He insisted that a man of means had a moral duty to help others. To the public he looked like a philosopher king, but inside the mills he looked more like a machine with a human name. And when the pressure of empire building became too much, Carnegie didn't double down, he distanced himself. He spent more and more time in Scotland, hosting dinner parties, walking in the Highlands, and reading Marcus Aurelius. Meanwhile, back in Pittsburgh, he needed someone to keep the furnaces hot and the workers in line. Enter Henry Clay Frick. Now, if Carnegie was steel, Frick was flint. Frick had built his fortune in coke, the fuel that powered steel furnaces. He knew how to cut costs, crack skulls, and keep unions out. He wasn't interested in philosophy. He believed workers were there to obey orders, not negotiate them. Carnegie admired Frick's results, but the two were opposites in tone. Carnegie played the violin. Frick played hardball. So when Carnegie placed Frick in charge of day-to-day operations at the Homestead Steel Works, it was a calculated move. Carnegie could polish his image from abroad while Frick handled the dirty work. And the work was about to get very dirty. By 1892, tensions had been rising at Homestead for months. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest unions in the country, was demanding better pay and safer conditions. Frick's answer? A wall. Literally, he built a 12-foot fence topped with barbed wire around the plant and hired hundreds of Pinkerton agents, private security men, with rifles, clubs and orders to break the strike. Carnegie? He was in Scotland, sipping tea and writing letters about world peace. Officially, he wasn't involved. Unofficially, he gave Frick full control. On July 6th, the Pinkertons arrived on barges, trying to retake the plant by force. Workers were waiting, guns fired, rocks flew, chaos erupted, 10 men were killed, dozens were wounded. It was one of the bloodiest labour clashes in American history. And the nation was watching. Public opinion turned fast. Newspapers, which once praised Carnegie as a model capitalist, now printed cartoons of him with blood-stained hands. The philosopher king image shattered. Carnegie tried to dodge blame. He claimed he hadn't known Frick's full plans, that the violence was a tragedy, not a strategy. But nobody bought it. He had built the empire, he had chosen the general, and now the battle had left bodies in the river. Homestead didn't just damage Carnegie's reputation, it exposed a deep hypocrisy. A man who claimed to serve humanity, yet broke the very people who built his fortune. And in private, it haunted him. He never truly forgave himself. He even drafted letters of apology to the workers. But he never mailed them. Frick, on the other hand, doubled down. He tightened control, fired union members, and bragged about his victory. But it wasn't without cost. Months later, he was shot in the neck by an anarchist who had no union ties but saw Frick as the face of capitalist cruelty. Frick survived, Carnegie's image didn't. But the steel kept flowing, and the money kept coming. And for Andrew Carnegie, a new phase began, one of atonement, reinvention, and perhaps illusion. He had conquered industry. Now, he would try to conquer morality. But can you really balance the scales when they're dripping with iron and ash? Next, we follow the transformation, the gospel of wealth, the libraries, the opera halls, and the question of whether you can rewrite a legacy built on the bones of a broken system. Steel doesn't bend easily, neither did Andrew Carnegie. But in July of 1892, something cracked, not in his furnaces, but in his legacy. Homestead, it sounds peaceful, doesn't it? Like a place where nothing bad could ever happen. But Homestead, Pennsylvania, was a war zone in everything but name. Let's rewind just a moment. The Homestead Steel Works was one of Carnegie's most important mills. It churned out the raw skeletons of America, beams, rails, columns. It also ran like a machine, fast, loud, unforgiving. 12-hour shifts were standard. Injuries weren't accidents, they were inevitabilities. But the men who worked there weren't just cogs. Many were unionized, organized under the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest and most respected labor unions in the country. Carnegie had always kept a complicated relationship with unions. Publicly, he claimed to respect them. Privately, he preferred control, complete control. As contract negotiations approached that summer, workers were asking for something simple, a fair wage. Carnegie's profits had soared, but wages hadn't followed. They wanted a share of the success they had bled to build. But Carnegie had a new strategy. He sailed to Scotland. Left behind? Henry Clay Frick, the man who saw compromise as weakness and unions as parasites. Carnegie's absence wasn't an accident. It was insulation. Plausible deniability wrapped in tartan. And Frick wasted no time. First, he cut off negotiations. Then he locked the workers out. Then he built a wall, literally, around the entire Homestead plant. 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire. Locals called it Fort Frick. It wasn't a factory anymore, it was a fortress. And then came the Pinkertons. They were private security agents, hired guns in every sense of the word. 300 of them boarded barges and floated up the Monongahela River in the middle of the night. Their mission? Break the strike. Retake the mill, but the workers saw them coming. On the morning of July 6th, the riverbank exploded into violence. Thousands of workers and townspeople confronted the Pinkertons. Some held clubs, some had pistols. Shots rang out. The battle raged for hours. The barges became warships. The river ran red. By nightfall, 10 men were dead, 7 workers, 3 Pinkertons. Dozens more were wounded. The Pinkertons surrendered, beaten and blooded. The town celebrated like it had won a revolution. But that victory didn't last. The state militia arrived within days, not to protect the workers, but to take back the mill. Armed soldiers marched into Homestead, the plant reopened, the union collapsed, workers were blacklisted. Power had spoken, and it spoke in rifles. And Andrew Carnegie? He was still in Scotland, writing letters about world peace, talking about books, planning his next donation. When news of the violence reached him, he issued statements of regret, but they were careful, polished, safe. He called it unfortunate, regrettable, a misunderstanding. But behind closed doors, it was clear Frick had done exactly what Carnegie expected. He had protected the empire, no matter the cost. And the cost was immense. The press turned on Carnegie. Newspapers that once praised his generosity now mocked his silence. Editorials called him a coward, a hypocrite, a man who spoke like Plato but acted like Caesar. And the public felt betrayed. How could the same man who built libraries and opera halls allow workers to be shot for asking to be heard? Even his own workers began to see the cracks in the polished image. They had admired him once, believed in the story of the immigrant who rose from nothing. But now they saw a man who had traded compassion for convenience, and it stung. For Carnegie, the guilt was real, but it came late. Too late. He later claimed he would have handled things differently, that he regretted trusting Frick, that he had no idea how brutal the strike would become. But those close to him knew better. He drafted letters of apology, some deeply personal, full of remorse, but he never sent them, not one. Frick, meanwhile, was nearly assassinated just weeks after the strike. An anarchist, completely unaffiliated with the union, entered his office, shot him twice, and stabbed him with a knife. Frick survived, barely, but he became even more hard-edged, even more unrepentant. Their relationship never recovered. Carnegie and Frick became rivals, then enemies, and as the years went on, their feud hardened. They stopped speaking, avoided each other in public. Each built monuments with their money but refused to bury the hatchet. Still, the steel empire didn't collapse. In fact, it grew stronger, bigger, richer. But so did the questions. What do you do when your legacy is made of iron, but your conscience is rusting? Carnegie tried to answer that. He turned his focus away from mills and toward morality, toward redemption. Next, we explore how the man who once crushed strikes tried to uplift societies. He wrote a gospel, built cathedrals of knowledge, gave away millions. But could money ever buy back the blood? By the time the fires at Homestead cooled and the headlines faded, Andrew Carnegie found himself standing in front of a mirror that no longer reflected a hero. The man who had once proudly worn the image of the enlightened capitalist, the immigrant-turned-industrialist with a heart for humanity, now saw that the empire he built cast shadows longer than its smokestacks. In public, he resumed his role as the great benefactor, but in private, something had shifted. Homestead had not just exposed the fault lines in his factories, it had fractured something in his sense of self. He returned to the United States more determined than ever to shape a legacy that would outlive the strikes, the anger, the blood. It wasn't just about rebuilding trust, it was about rewriting the story. And so, in 1889, he sat down to write what would become one of the most influential and controversial essays in American economic history, The Gospel of Wealth. In it, Carnegie argued that great wealth came with even greater responsibility. He condemned mere inheritance, criticised hoarding, and urged the wealthy to serve as stewards of public good. Money, he said, should be used to improve the condition of the people, not simply decorate the lives of their children. It was, on the surface, a noble vision. He called upon millionaires to act not as kings, but as trustees. Not to give aimlessly, but to uplift strategically. Libraries, schools, parks and museums would serve the soul of a nation far better than cash in envelopes. But beneath that vision lived a tension. Because while Carnegie was now giving away millions, he had made those millions by opposing the very labour demands. He now seemed to support fair pay, safer conditions, a voice for the working class. For many, it was difficult to reconcile the image of the steel titan funding a library with the memory of Pinkertons storming a mill. Still, Carnegie did not waver. He moved forward with astonishing energy and even more astonishing generosity. He began pouring money into libraries across America, over 2,000 of them. To be exact, believing that the written word could do more for a working man than any raise ever could. He built Carnegie Hall in New York, not as a monument to himself, but as a temple for music, a place where the arts could be made accessible to all. He established the Carnegie Institution for Science, funded universities in the United States and Scotland, and launched the Carnegie Foundation for the advancement of teaching. Education, he believed, was the great equalizer, the true path out of poverty. In speeches, he returned often to a single theme, that wealth, if used wisely, could lift entire generations. And yet the guilt never truly left him. He rarely spoke directly about Homestead, but those close to him knew that the events of that summer remained a private torment. In rare moments, he admitted that he had failed his men, and he kept drafts of letters that he had intended to send to the families of the dead letters that remained unsigned. The most painful irony of all, Carnegie never set foot in Homestead again. As the years passed, his giving accelerated. By the turn of the century, he had given away hundreds of millions, the equivalent of billions today. He called wealth a sacred trust, and declared that the man who dies rich dies disgraced, but not everyone saw it that way. To some labour advocates, Carnegie's philanthropy was just a cosmetic fix to a deeper structural problem, an attempt to mop up the mess of inequality without addressing its source. To them, no number of libraries could make up for a lifetime of suppressed wages and broken backs. And yet, it's hard to ignore what he built or what he tried to repair. His libraries taught generations of immigrants to read. His schools gave thousands a chance to become more than just workers. His foundations funded discoveries in medicine, science, and education that still echo today. Andrew Carnegie did not try to erase his past, not entirely. Instead, he tried to build over it, to plant gardens where his furnaces once roared, to leave behind something beautiful in a country that had seen so much fire. But even in this phase of redemption, a reckoning was coming. Because the empire he had spent his life assembling was about to be sold in full to another titan, a man even more focused, more calculating, and perhaps more ruthless, J.P. Morgan. And when that handshake happened, when the empire changed hands, Carnegie would become the richest man in the world. But in that moment of victory, he said something that would surprise even his closest allies. Stay with me, because next we step into the room where steel met finance, and where a billion-dollar deal left one man triumphant and another slightly amused. By the dawn of the 20th century, Andrew Carnegie had built the most powerful steel company on earth. His mills shaped the nation's skyline, fed its railroads, and armoured its battleships. But Carnegie, now in his mid-60s, had grown weary. Not of wealth he had plenty, but of business itself. He was tired of the pace, the politics, the endless negotiations. He had done what he set out to do. He had taken a poor immigrant's dream and forged it into an empire of iron and ambition. Now he wanted peace, and perhaps one last theatrical gesture. Enter John Pierpont Morgan. Where Carnegie was an empire builder, Morgan was a consolidator, a man of stern eyes and silent rooms. He believed in efficiency not only of labour but of ownership. He didn't like competition, he liked monopolies. He had already reshaped American finance by stitching together broken railroads and shaky banks. Now he wanted to do the same for steel. Morgan knew that the only real obstacle to total control of the steel industry was Andrew Carnegie. So, in a move both bold and inevitable, he sent Charles Schwab Carnegie Steel's young president, and one of the few men Carnegie truly trusted to float the idea, sell it all. For years, Carnegie had resisted. The business was his masterpiece, his legacy. But now, surrounded by wealth, titles, and enough libraries to fill a nation, he felt the moment had come. And so, one evening in December of 1900, over a quiet dinner at the University Club in New York, Carnegie scribbled a number on a piece of paper and handed it to Schwab. $480 million. No negotiation, no haggling. That was the price, take it or leave it. Schwab delivered the note to Morgan. The banker read it, nodded once, and said simply, "I accept." It was the largest business transaction in American history. With that, Carnegie Steel was absorbed into US Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Morgan, as its architect, now controlled more capital than some European countries. Carnegie, in turn, became for a time the richest man alive. But here's where the story gets interesting. When Carnegie heard about Morgan's acceptance, he smiled and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Morgan. You are now the richest man in the world." Then, after a pause, he added, "And I am the happiest." And in that moment, he meant it. Carnegie had long viewed wealth as a tool, not an end. Now he had the freedom to do what he claimed to care about most, give it away. But not everyone believed him. Critics saw the sale not as a graceful exit, but as a strategic dodge, a way to offload the moral weight of an industry built on bruised hands and scorched lungs. With US Steel under Morgan's control, Carnegie could claim clean hands, even as the profits continued to soar. Still, he didn't look back. In the years that followed, Carnegie withdrew almost entirely from the world of industry. No more boardrooms, no more strikes, no more headlines about productivity or labour costs. He bought a castle in Scotland, vacationed with royalty, wrote essays on peace, and gave interviews to journalists who were more interested in his donations than his past decisions. But he never forgot what it took to build his fortune, nor did he forget the people who had helped him build it, even if he had once looked the other way when they suffered. He once said, "I resolved to stop accumulating and begin the infinitely more serious and difficult task of wise distribution." And he followed through. He funded over 2,000 libraries, built Carnegie Mellon University, endowed institutions in Scotland, the US, and beyond. He established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, because if war was the furnace that consumed nations, he wanted to be remembered as a man who tried to cool it. But there were still tensions he couldn't resolve. His relationship with Henry Clay Frick had soured beyond repair. The two men never reconciled. When Frick was dying, Carnegie sent a note asking to visit. Frick reportedly told the messenger, "Tell him I'll see him in hell." And then there was the unshakable shadow of Homestead, the strike he never publicly addressed, the violence he never fully condemned. For all his giving, Carnegie remained haunted by the one thing he couldn't buy: forgiveness. Still, the Morgan deal had granted him one final gift time to reflect, time to rewrite, time to build not just monuments of steel, but monuments of conscience. And yet, even as he tried to spend his wealth into virtue, another thought kept rising. What if the entire system had been flawed from the beginning? What if giving back after taking too much wasn't justice, but a late apology? In his final years, Carnegie tried to answer that question, and in doing so he stepped onto a global stage, not as an industrialist, but as an advocate for peace, a voice against war, a voice that, tragically, the world would ignore, because what happened next would be beyond his reach, even with all the steel, all the books, and all the billions. Next, we follow Carnegie into his final transformation, not as a businessman, but as a dreamer, chasing peace while the world prepared for fire. By the time Andrew Carnegie exited the steel business, he was no longer building factories, he was building ideals, or trying to, now in his twilight years, with more money than any one man could reasonably use, he turned his full attention to something that had always tugged at the corners of his conscience: peace. It wasn't just a personal goal. It became his mission, his obsession, his crusade. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were bristling with nationalism, colonial rivalry, and a hunger for arms. Empires were flexing, alliances were tightening, and Carnegie, of all people, saw where it was heading. He had helped shape the machinery of progress, but now he feared that same machinery would be used to tear the world apart. So he tried to intervene. He funded peace organizations, launched forums, and sent out letters to presidents, kings, professors, and anyone who would listen. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace was born not as a token gesture, but as a real attempt to steer the world away from war. He financed a grand palace of peace in The Hague, a marble monument, where disputes between nations could, in theory, be resolved not with bullets, but with diplomacy and law. The Peace Palace, as it was called, was part temple, part courtroom, part dream. Carnegie believed that reason would prevail. That war was an outdated institution, a relic of barbarism. He was convinced that if leaders simply talked to each other, really talked, they'd see that bullets were bad business, and that peace could be engineered just as reliably as steel rails and iron bridges. But the world, it turned out, didn't run on reason. The early 1900s were a powder keg, tensions in Europe were growing, the Balkans were burning, and Carnegie's hopeful vision of arbitration and moral progress was being drowned out by the sound of boots marching toward borders. Still, he pushed forward. He gave speeches about the brotherhood of man. He called war a foulest stain upon civilization. He reminded people that the wealth of a nation was not in its armies, but in its ideas. It was an earnest plea from a man who had once made cannonballs for the Union Army, a contradiction that never sat quite right, even with him. But there's something almost tragic about how Carnegie tried to balance those two selves, the industrialist who armed a nation and the idealist who later begged it to disarm. He was no longer naive. He understood that peace required more than good intentions. But perhaps, in his urgency, he underestimated the depth of the world's appetite for violence, or how little influence even the richest man on earth could have when national pride was at stake. And then there was the personal weight he carried. Carnegie's feud with Henry Clay Frick had hardened into silence. Their partnership, once so central to the steel empire, ended with bitterness and pride. Carnegie, near the end of his life, tried to repair the damage. He reached out, offered reconciliation, but Frick refused. He never forgot the betrayal, or perhaps never believed the apology was sincere. When Frick died in 1919, Carnegie reportedly wept, not because they had been close in the end, they hadn't, but because something about that unfinished business haunted him. One more thing he couldn't fix with money, one more thing he'd have to carry to the grave. Still, the philanthropy never stopped. Carnegie gave away over $350 million during his lifetime, the equivalent of tens of billions today. He funded schools, research institutions, libraries, and artistic spaces. He once said he wanted to die poor, and by the end, he was almost there, not financially, but philosophically. He had spent a lifetime building structures that touched the sky, but in his final years, he was far more interested in the invisible, in the way ideas linger after a man is gone, in the legacy of books and questions and second chances. And even as the clouds of World War I began to gather, even as it became clear that peace might not come in his lifetime, he held on to hope, maybe not for himself, but for the generations ahead. Carnegie died in August of 1919, just months after the guns of the Great War finally fell silent. He didn't live to see the full aftermath. He never saw the Treaty of Versailles or the seeds it would plant for yet another, even more devastating conflict. But he had seen enough to know that progress was not linear, that dreams take longer than lifetimes, and that peace, true peace, is never handed down. It has to be built. Like steel, but stronger. And yet, one question remained unanswered. In all his giving, all his writing, and all his building, was there one thing Andrew Carnegie never truly had the courage to face? That brings us to his final chapter. Not about steel, not about libraries, but about a letter. One he wrote, one he revised, one he never sent. And in that silence perhaps lies the most honest part of his story. There's a kind of weight that fortune can't lift, and by the end of his life, Andrew Carnegie carried it quietly, almost reverently, like a stone in his pocket. It wasn't a debt or a scandal or a secret clause in some steel contract. It was a letter, one he had written to the workers of Homestead, or rather one he had written to their ghosts. For years, the events of July 6th, 1892, hovered over him like smoke from a furnace that refused to die down. He rarely spoke of it, even as he spoke endlessly about generosity, progress, and the moral duties of the wealthy. To the public, he had moved on, but privately the story remained unfinished. In the last decade of his life, Carnegie spent more time alone, not isolated exactly, but more reflective. He took to long walks, he read obsessively, he surrounded himself with books and silence. And in that silence, the past began knocking. Perhaps it was a sense of time running out. Perhaps it was the distance from power. Or perhaps, as his influence waned and history crept closer behind him, he began to see what no amount of libraries or peace palaces could erase. Homestead had not been an accident. It had been a decision. One that was made in quiet rooms, with carefully chosen men, and with the full knowledge that force might be required to maintain order. And while he had delegated the brutality to Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie knew that Frick had only carried out what his system demanded. Denying that was always easier than acknowledging it. But toward the end, he stopped denying. At some point, no one is quite sure when Carnegie began drafting a letter addressed not to the press, not to Congress, but to the workers of Homestead. It was handwritten, confessional. Not a defence, and not exactly an apology either. It was something harder to define, the voice of a man trying to make sense of what it means to win. In it, he expressed sorrow, not just for the bloodshed, but for his failure to stand between profit and principle when it mattered most. He admitted that he had misjudged Frick, misjudged the moment, and perhaps misjudged himself. He didn't excuse the violence, he didn't argue for context. He simply acknowledged that his silence had spoken louder than any speech he might have given at the time. The letter was deeply personal, written in the same careful hand that had once calculated rail contracts and profit margins. But unlike his published essays, this one was not meant for distribution. It was never sent. Why not? Some say he feared it would stir up old wounds. Others suggest that his advisers, always protective of his legacy, urged him to let the matter lie. And it's possible Carnegie himself didn't believe it would change anything, that the words, though sincere, were too late to matter. But the fact that he wrote it and rewrote it multiple times reveals something important. Beneath all the accolades, beneath the polished biographies and gold-plated philanthropy, Carnegie was still wrestling with the boy he had been and the man he had become. He had come to America with nothing, built a fortune beyond imagination, shaped industries, reinvented public giving, dreamed of peace, and yet, at the very end, the thing he seemed to want most wasn't another statue or endowment. It was redemption. And perhaps, just perhaps, he understood that some debts can't be paid with money, only with truth. Andrew Carnegie died on August 11th, 1919, in Lenox, Massachusetts. The world remembered him as a philanthropist, a titan of steel, a friend to education and peace. Streets and schools bore his name. So did concert halls, foundations and libraries in cities he never even visited. But the full story, the one behind the monuments, is more human. He was ambitious, generous, brilliant, and at times painfully blind. He believed in lifting others up, but didn't always see who he was stepping on. He gave away his fortune, but never gave away the burden that came with how it was made. The letter he never sent still exists tucked away among his papers, preserved by archivists who understood that some documents are more than history, they're confessions. And as you drift away from this story, perhaps that's the image to hold on to, not the towers of steel or the sound of a gavel at some billion-dollar deal, but an old man, pen in hand, trying to write his way back to the beginning, trying to explain himself, trying to be heard not by the world, but by the ones who had no voice at all,